Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all. I've got a post-lunch graveyard shift today to do this in. So no dozing off. We'll be watching and filming as well. So I think most of you certainly will know me. Some of you won't. I'm Stephen Burt. I'm the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director here at NQA. So I look after the delivery and the development of all of our sustainability services, products and services, including the carbon side of what we do. I've been with NQA for a long time, 18 years actually. So I started out as an ISO auditor, much like many of you are. And over the years, I've done various roles within the company. And for the last 2 years or so, I've been the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director. Although the business unit has only really existed for those 2 years, the Sustainability Business Unit, NQA have actually been doing sustainability things for longer than you might think. It's not just about the carbon services that we deliver. We also have the chain of custody and the supply chain services which we deliver, which include wider social and governance issues as well as environmental issues. And obviously we have the carbon services themselves. But for those of you who are doing things like environmental auditing for ISO 14001, quality auditing for ISO 9001, health and safety auditing for ISO 45001, all of those things are contributing towards sustainable development as well. So it's not just about the carbon, and hopefully that'll come through the conversation that we have today. NQA have been doing this for a long time. Richard Walsh and I were both auditing against a very old standard called BS 8555, which was the very first Sustainable Development Management System standard. And Richard and I think, were auditing that in about 2008 or 2010 or something like that. It was too early. It was before its time. It didn't catch on. The clients weren't particularly interested. Times change. Sustainable development, carbon, supply chain, chain of custody is all very high on the agenda now for our clients and the clients within their supply chains. So on my sustainability travels, I've met lots of distinguished friends and colleagues over the years. So I'd just like to ask everybody to introduce themselves, give a little bit of background to your role within sustainable development. If you're in the TIC industry, talk about that. If you're in the consultancy industry, talk about that as well. So Richard, would you like to start first?
Yeah, good afternoon. Does it work? Hello, can you?
No?
I don't think the mic's working. I tell you what, I'll speak loudly. Good afternoon, everyone. Richard Nunn. I chair the Independent Certification Board. So I'm basically not part of NQ whatsoever. I actually work for the Environment Agency. I'm a civil engineer by background. My sort of professional interest is very much in project development, and carbon is one of the big issues we have. Environment Agency got a lot of airtime lately. Regulator on one hand, could be back on. Regulator on one hand, operator on the other. Two don't really go well together, but anyway, we will be 30 years old this coming year. But there's big change coming in the water industry, and that will include the Environment Agency. Just one final thing as a stat, in our operational side, 50% of our carbon is from construction. So we work a lot with the supply chain, and certainly PAS 2080 is becoming really a key thing. We're renewing frameworks this year. All of our suppliers will be expected to have that in place. So I can see going forward there's quite a lot of change coming, certainly in the water industry and with some of the clients that you probably work with. Certainly from my perspective, I can see big change in terms of how we look at sustainability and our expectation of projects going forward. So I look forward to this afternoon, and thank you for inviting me.
I think I've got mine. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jerry Findlay. I'm from a company called Sustainable Footprints. But background-wise, I've been poacher, gamekeeper, and everything along those lines. So our day-to-day business does carbon consulting, adding it up mainly, energy auditing, energy improvement and strategy, things along those lines. We also have a software business where we do carbon accounting. Historically, I've also worked for the dreaded word UCAS, auditing the certification bodies. I've also worked as external resource for some of the external bodies and product manager for a CB, setting up their verification product. So I literally am the gamekeeper and poacher, and I absolutely love how the interrelations of all of these work and how it affects normal business and what the carbon and sustainability agenda impacts businesses not only on their own turnover and on their own business, but their own operational risk, which includes my own business as well. So that's the perspective I look to bring for you guys today.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Baxter. I am Deputy Chief Exec at the Institute of Sustainability and Environmental Professionals. So we're the professional body for people working in sustainability and environment. We have about 22,000 individual members in around about 125 countries. My role is catching lots of different things. A lot of it is externally facing, working with various organisations here in the UK, but also internationally. I chair the group in ISO responsible for about 15 standards, I think I have in my portfolio. So anything from natural capital accounting to environmental economics, material flow cost accounting, and 14,001. So yeah, an eclectic mix of standards there. I'm also a visiting professor on sustainability at Cranfield University, and I'm a fellow of ISO and a chartered environmentalist. As an organisation, we're an accredited body with, as an observer with both the Biodiversity Convention, so the Convention on Biological Diversity, and we'll be at the IPBES International kind of Summit in Manchester next month. And we're also a United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change accredited observer as well, so we get involved in the COP process to a certain extent. And we're also a member of UCAS alongside about 30 other organisations which are mainly government departments and agencies.
Great, thank you, Martin. Ariella?
Hi everyone, I'm Ariella Schnittmann. I'm originally from Argentina, but I have been working in sustainability across different countries. I've been working in the US, Australia, Ireland, now here. So I have kind of like a mix and match accent, so sorry about that. Interrupt me if there's something that you don't understand. But I think that gave me a very broad understanding of what the main sustainability challenges are across the world. And right now I work for World's Better. We are a sustainability consultancy for the event industry, which represents 10% of the carbon emissions globally, which is a very interesting sector to work with. There's so much potential there. And we work with different agencies or corporations, helping them get different certifications and different standards, lots of ISO work, of course. And what I found really interesting is how this work towards these certifications gives companies the opportunity to kind of like create a baseline and understand what the challenges and the gaps are, and how they start kind of like rethinking the way they do things and their own operations and the way they engage with their suppliers as well. So hopefully we'll get to discuss this.
Perfect, thank you, Ariel. Raul?
Yeah, hi everybody, good to be here. I'm Raul. I'm representing Kiva, so I'm from the same group, and I'm leading the business sector sustainability services. And here we have different focus areas, sustainability metrics, so where we are looking at all the carbon footprinting, life cycle assessment on product level, company level, and so on, but also on emission trading systems where we are active. Then another focus, circular economy, with the different kind of recycling schemes and the sustainability sustainability due diligence, where we try to fulfill the requirements which are coming from different kind of due diligence laws when it comes to environmental and social aspects. And from background, I'm an environmental engineer, started at Kiva almost 9 years ago, and I'm also working for the Technical University in Berlin, researching on environmental friendly construction products, especially on alternative concrete products.
Excellent, great. So we've got a really kind of distinguished panel here. We've got good, strong representation of some of the drivers from the EU and throughout the rest of the world as well. We've got some good input in terms of regulatory and policy direction at national government level as well. Very strong carbon accounting background, and the regulatory and operational side from the Environment Agency too. So we've got a really good panel here. We'll have a discussion as we go. If anybody has any questions, maybe write them down or keep them in the back of your mind, and we'll take some questions towards the end of the session, if that's okay. So let's just start with the big question, I guess. What is sustainable development? What does it mean? You know, the term's been around for a long time. It's a bit of a buzzword. The recognition of the term seems to be increasing as time goes on. We're about to see the world's first ISO standard for sustainable development management systems being published this year, actually 2026. And it's worth just perhaps framing that in terms of global population as well. So we all live on the same planet. When I was at school, we were taught that in the UK, 55 million people lived here. There's now more like 70 million people live here. When I was at school, which wasn't that long ago, we were taught that 4 billion people lived on this planet. Now it's 8 billion people. We've got the same amount of resources to use. We've got the same planet to live on. You know, how can we tackle the challenge of achieving sustainable development under those circumstances? Anybody like to start off with that, the very big question, I guess?
Well, I'll have a go. I mean, I think when we explain sustainability, we tend to draw on the what's called the donut economics model. And what it says is basically that as a human civilization, and I think it's kind of worth saying that sustainability is generally seen through a human lens, but it is that need to provide that social foundation. So it's access to water for sanitation and hydration. It's access to food, it's access to energy, somewhere to live, somebody to work, the calories that you need, health, education. The kind of things that we would say are actually kind of at the floor, at the basic level that everybody should have access to. And it's to deliver all of that within the environmental limits and the capacity that we have to provide that. And we have, you know, as you kind of just been saying, we have one planet, and that planet has to be able to sustain people to be able to kind of live in that social fabric in a coherent, consistent, and a way which would take us over a long period of time. And just to build on your kind of your global population, you know, the population's projection for the globe, for the world at the moment, is that in the next 25 years there'll be another 1.5 billion people on the planet. And those people do have aspiration for somewhere to live, somewhere to work. Many people might want a fridge or a freezer. They might want enough calories to eat and not go hungry. They might want clean water to drink, and it to be available when they need it, when they want it. And that puts massive pressure on our natural systems. And at the moment, those natural systems aren't in a position to sustain that level of consumption, and so we're out of balance. And sustainability and sustainable development is reconfiguring the way in which we live and work in order to bring that back into harmony. So that's how I describe sustainability. And to kind of fast forward, I think we've actually got all the answers. We know how to do it. we've much got all the technologies to provide clean water, to provide clean energy, to provide food without destroying our natural capital. So then it's around how we organise ourselves and critically reorganise ourselves to be able to do that. And that, to my mind, is the challenge of our time. And that's what we are, as a professional body, is up for.
Absolutely. Yep, Ariella?
Yeah, I'm just going to be a little bit disruptive there.
Go for it.
I do really think sustainable development is not something that we need to achieve. I don't think that it's something achievable. I think it should be a direction. It should be a lens or a mechanism that we apply in the decision-making process. So every time as a person, as a business, as an organization, as a country, as a region, we're making decisions, we should be making it through that lens, using that approach. It would be like someone saying, I want to be healthy. Yes, that's perfect, that's ideal. What you can do is try to have a healthy life or healthy behavior, but that requires a behavioral change, and this is exactly the same. So I think, yes, I agree with you, Martin. We have all the answers. We have the technology. We know what to do. We know what the challenges are and what the solutions are, but we need to change the way we do things, and we need to be brave enough to implement that in our daily lives and in the way that we do business.
Yep, Jerry?
So if you're happy for me to add on to what you've both said, I absolutely agree with you, Martin, about sustainability is about balance. What we have to realise is everyone sees it as a singular answer, and often sustainability is which sacrifice are you making more? So when we turn around, for example, you were talking about health. If your health is working less, that affects your economics, which means you might have less money to spend elsewhere. So I think often the decisions need to come around more, feeling slightly more negative of what do we need to sacrifice to in order to gain those balances. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. When you read those, they're often written very high level and government level, and actually trying to draw those down to a level that can be applied in a business's decision-making or an operations decision-making is often very hard. And it's finding a way of quantifying those decisions, allowing those sacrifices to be made without too much penalty, that then would allow you to quantify them, achieve them, and moving beyond quantification. So when we turn around and say we need to be using them for decision, like with any of our risk processes, how do we justify that? You know, if I'm going to reduce my carbon and do carbon offsetting, does that mean I have to close one of my offices or operations down, which puts people out of work? How do we justify that realignment and basic? How do we take this to different levels? Finding a matrix that works, that doesn't hinder us by making the sacrifices that we need. That's what true sustainability is. It isn't a singular answer to a question. It's multiple answers in a harmonised approach.
But interesting that Martin and Ariel have both mentioned that those answers already exist, and they do. You know, even in my lifetime, early, you know, we would throw all our waste away, it would go to landfill. Since then, almost no waste goes to landfill. We all recycle every day. We have industries which have been created to reprocess that waste. Last year, 2025, the UK would produce over 50% of its electricity generation from non-fossil fuel sources, for example. So things are progressing very quickly towards the direction that we're looking for here. Raoul?
I agree with you, and I like what you all said. So we have certain answers, or we know where to go, but we also have some really critical points which have an influence on society, and this is also why the whole sustainability sector has kind of a backlash at the moment. So if we are taking, for instance, or the example of concrete and cement. So for cement, we don't have really easy, or let's say we could technically have maybe some solutions, but these will be expensive. And also, or let's say maybe not expensive, or will be a shift of money flows, and we also need to be then willing to, I don't know, have way higher housing building prices, because the environmental impacts will be quantified and will be monitorized, and this changed the whole system. So I think in a way, yeah, we have solutions, but implementing that, getting that into society, we still have quite a challenge in front of us, I think.
Yeah.
Could I just add on? I think it's also moving that viewfinder. When we talk sustainability, everybody automatically looks at the green thing, the carbon, the environment, but actually the sustainability thing does need to impact the social side. I know one of the issues when we've been looking at carbon offsets, and a lot of the reasons some of the carbon offsets have a bad reputation, is because to create that carbon offset, the trees in Amazon, you're moving indigenous people back into the cities, which then hits equality and poverty. So it's actually slightly moving the lens, if we're genuinely talking sustainability, from just the environment to the wider impact and looking at that holistic view. My apologies.
Yeah, Richard?
Yeah, perhaps if I just give a view as to what it might look on the ground, sustainable development, certainly from the Environment Agency's point of view. And there's two sides to this. There's the water side of it, the supply. I can tell you now that by 2050 we're going to need 30% more water than we currently have. Mm-hmm. We're currently building in this country 10 reservoirs, having not built one for the last 40 years. That will only give us about 5% of what we need. So the reality is, how are you going to achieve that? Controversially, an aspect is water's too cheap. So the customer, I think, will end up paying more. Leakage is a big factor. So from a water supply point of view, sustainability is about literally, are we going to have enough water to meet all our demands, particularly with IT, data centres, etc. On the operational side, we get involved a lot with building flood defences, which is sort of my world. And the argument is always about whatever we do today shouldn't compromise generations in meeting their needs. But the reality is you're compromising economics, you're compromising people and property, and you're compromising the environment to achieve an outcome. More and more the environment is a bigger factor. But the reality is, and you'll see it over the next few days on the East Coast, there's properties that are going to fall into the ocean on the East Coast. So therefore, if you're going to really look at sustainability seriously on the ground, certainly in flood defence, you've got to accept that certain things cannot be the way we've got them. But trying to make those decisions and implement them on the ground is very difficult.
Yeah, so I mean, everybody I think has mentioned it's a kind of iterative process. It's small, tiny steps to get to the state of sustainable development, which Ariella quite rightly mentioned isn't actually achievable. You know, it's something to progress towards. But how do we measure that then? So, you know, each year the United Nations produces a Sustainable Development Index. It's based on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which I think Jerry mentioned, and measures each of the 193 members of the United Nations against them. The UK actually does very well. The UK, I think, was 11th place for 2025. Germany was 4th place for 2025. Finland was number 1. Lass, if you're out there, you can celebrate. Yep, there he is. So Finland was number 1. But do we agree that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are the most suitable means of measuring the progress towards sustainable development? Raoul?
Maybe I can make a comment regarding the place of Germany. It also was because of the reduced industry activities. So
yeah, offshoring.
You
yeah,
see
there's
again,
a lot. Yeah, absolutely.
What you would like to have. Coming back to the question with the sustainability development goals, I think it's a good concept on a high level, and we need something on a really high level with the different indicators and parameters of sustainability. But so I face every day the challenge in cascading these down towards then also industry, manufacturing, and so on. So I think it is important, but at the moment I see more the challenge in cascading those concepts down really and also tackling the areas where we have the highest emissions, because we do have made a lot of reporting initiatives, regulations, which are now reduced by the European Commission, and maybe some of them were also going too far, and we were not looking at the most critical criteria for now. No, of course, it needs to be always further developed, because if we can't just talk about carbon emissions, because we also need to look at biodiversity and so on, but we also need to be careful that we don't get lost in trying to solve it all at once. Or this was some years ago, maybe in some concepts, the idea, and now we really have to fight for keeping parts of the European Green Deal and so on, I think.
Yeah, Ariella?
Yeah, if I can add on that, I think it really depends on who's measuring, what's the stakeholder who's measuring, and why they're measuring, and what they're going to do with that information. So most organizations right now are not measuring because they are very, very overwhelmed. So what's happening right now, there's so many standards, so many frameworks. Some of them contradict each other, some of them are really different. They have different KPIs, different targets, different ways of measuring different variables. So it's creating paralysis. And I think that's the big problem that we have right now in terms of sustainability, is that paralysis, or most organizations not knowing where to start or how to start, how long it's going to take, what resources do I need, how much money am I going to invest on this, and what am I going to do with that information? Is this going to be more paperwork adding up to my big pile of papers here for me to read, here for me to report to someone? What am I going to do with that? So every time we work with a client, with an organization, we always start by trying to understand the organization itself, what challenges they have and what resources they have available to them. And the entire measurement process should allow you to have a more positive impact and reduce your negative impact. So I think, yes, the SDGs are a great framework, but depends what you're using it for. So if I'm working with an SME, that's not the framework I'm going to use, because it's going to be very overwhelming, and it won't be able for me to kind of like implement that in a way that's going to be useful for them. So I think it's a great mechanism, but depends on what you're going to use it for.
Your point about standardization is fantastic, because if I am a major customer, for example, and I want to know that my supply chain can do things at a suitably high level of quality for me, I would mandate they achieve ISO 9001. Similarly, for environmental, I would mandate they achieve 14001, for health and safety 45001. It's a really cluttered marketplace when it comes to sustainability and supply chains. We have, for example, GRI, EcoVadis, B Corp, SBTI, the GHG protocol, the carbon disclosure program, on top of the ISO standards that exist around these things. So it is a very different marketplace for a company to be able to demonstrate their commitments to sustainable development. Martin, did you have any thoughts on the world of standardization, including ISO standards?
Yeah, I mean, and I do think it's important to recognize why standards have been created in particular ways and what their purpose was. So the SDGs were not created for companies. Sustainable Development Goals only apply to countries. They were created as a framework, just say, here are 17 goals, so whether it's around climate change, hunger, poverty, access to education, a whole range of different topic areas, and then within that, a whole set of targets for countries to achieve. How countries go about trying to achieve them is very much up to them, because they are at different levels of both development, they have completely different contexts, they have a different political and economic structure and social structures, and so it's how they then operationalize that in a way which then, in aggregate, ideally kind of contributes to a cleaner, greener, more equitable kind of human race on planet. And that was that was the genesis behind the creation of the SDGs. And the SDGs were created because the Millennium Development Goals singularly failed, and that was very much because, a large part of that was because it was, actually it's only for the least developed countries. They're the ones that need to focus on this. And actually, the transition to the SDGs is the recognition that we are a massive part of the problem. And until that kind of happened, and obviously kind of things like the Framework Convention on Climate Change and Biodiversity, where it became much more of a global, it's all of our responsibility. And actually, we are a big driver of poor environmental quality, poor social quality in other parts of the world. Then actually, those are the kind of things that these frameworks are there to develop. I think having standardized ways of doing things and being able to share and support is really important. That's why I get involved in developing those global standards. And because they can be effective. And generally, there's no better way. So they're not perfect, but they're better than nothing.
Yeah, interestingly, the new ISO 53001 standard, which Raoul and I are excited about, will be based on those 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and that's at business level, but only because there isn't a better way of doing it. I think you're dead right there. Jerry, did you want to add something?
Yes, if that's okay. I think some of the elements with the standardised framework is that it needs to be almost a reset and a simplification, and leaning on what you said, Ariella, about why the company's doing it. Everyone who does 1464 knows your intended user is your priority. Why is the business doing it? But bringing it back so it's not about calculating the number anymore. Like you do your financial accounts within business, that's just business as normal. You all add them up in the same way. You've all got the same scope and boundary. Drawing back your carbon footprinting so it follows that standardised scope boundary methodology makes sense, because the biggest risk we've got, in my view, on the carbon footprinting and the emissions side is the fact it's become a business doing the number. It's become a marketing ploy. So there's a whole business in selling the calculation. There's a whole business in doing the marketing. Now, if you think about most of your businesses who operate doing accounts normally, the business isn't doing, you might sell bookkeepers, but most people will in-house that. The business is the chartered accountants who do the assurance and check that they've added up in a consistent and repeatable and robust way. And that means the businesses can stop focusing on spending all the time adding the number and looking at how they implement those improvements, how they actually make those strategies and changes. When you look at the SDGs, and we're talking about balance on decision making between environmental carbon footprinting and then poverty alleviation, food and water for people, and equality, being able to make that choice because your numbers just calculated, and having a matrix used for the SDG goals that actually has a quantifiable matrix that's spread out, that builds on those standards, would be, I feel, a much stronger approach. So reducing some of the standards, so the one standards we do use are robust, repeatable and comparable across the function. So the business isn't then the business of doing, it's the business of delivering.
You're not necessarily comparing apples and apples at the minute. But interesting that you mentioned, Jerry and I were at a Carbon Accounting Alliance event recently, and another chap from Auditel was there that I knew, and he came over to me and he said he and I were the only people in that room with grey hair. Everybody else in that room was in their 20s or in their early 30s, because it's become an industry in itself, counting carbon, I think. And is that undertaken at the expense of, for example, biodiversity then? Because this is equally as important in achieving sustainable development. Do we think there's too strong a focus on counting carbon?
Carbon's really easy. We have one unified way, one currency for all global climate gases. Nature is locationally contextualized. It's made up of, and natural capital is made up of multiple different types, so whether it's water, whether it's different species, whether it's other types of habitat, etc. And understanding interdependencies and then being able to quantify in a way which is easy to communicate both what your impacts are on that and how those aggregate together and then what you're going to do about them is really difficult. So all the work on nature-related financial disclosures is a big challenge. But what we are seeing is companies getting a much better understanding of some of those interdependencies and actually putting money into managing those because they see it as a big threat and a risk to their business. So an example would be Nestlé in the UK, which pays a sustainability premium to farmers and growers who enhance the quality of the natural capital and natural assets that they have, because they see that as being a way of managing risk in their supply chain. Nescafe, the coffee brand, in 2023, committed a billion Swiss francs to regenerative agriculture for coffee bean growers, because climate impacts on coffee bean growers threaten hundreds of thousands of suppliers, but the economic cost of transitioning to regenerative agriculture for coffee bean growers, you have a reduction in yield. And they don't get paid very much anyway. And so actually but Nescafe without coffee beans is worth absolute zero.
Yeah.
And so we are seeing companies starting to understand these nature-based dependencies and put financial resources into enhancing and managing them. I think this question about economics and cost is really important. Economics is all about value exchange. And we have a system which doesn't value the things that are really important and which we are all dependent on. So there's a really big challenge for economics and the finance system in terms of what do we value and how do we value things and how do we change that. GDP is an absolutely atrocious way of managing quantifying that kind of value exchange at a national level. So there are some kind of big challenges, and it does provoke perverse outcomes. And while I'm on a bit of a roll, the other aspect, of course, is what we call the tragedy of the horizon. We know that the climate is changing. We know that we don't have enough water for 2050 in the UK. Even though we will have more water than we can cope with, we don't have enough water, okay? So we know that that's a problem. And yet the short-term political structures and decision-making structures and company decision-making structures means that we always find other things to do that don't actually give us that longer-term kind of decision-making for things that we know are going to happen. And we can see it already happening. And that's the kind of that tragedy of the horizon, and bringing those longer-term issues into today's decision-making and action is kind of part of this challenge of the time to delivering on a more sustainable future.
Well,
although you said that carbon is maybe easy, and it's easier than biodiversity and so on, for sure what I face daily is that we already in the carbon, we have the different standards, different calculation rules, and we can't compare it. So if you want to do a corporate carbon footprint, it's different assumptions. If you are going into product carbon footprint, there are different rules. If you're going into emission trading systems, it's again different calculation rules. So I think this message still needs to be or get more into the politics to say, okay, we can even simplify by harmonizing some topics, and then there will be also less effort for the companies to conduct the calculation. It might be good for NQA and Kiva because we want to verify it after this standard and so on, but not for the transition. And also, maybe coming to your point, Martin, of the financials sector or system, what I think is a good approach also with the emission trading system, so putting a price on carbon, and expanding this. So the EU is expanding it towards the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so in a way internationalizing it. UK falls also under the CBAM now, but they also like an own system. I think this is also maybe one way to go to really put on the price on the emissions and implementing it into the financial system.
Yeah, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism is actually an attempt to address the offshoring of heavy manufacturing and so on. Interestingly, we've just had the coalition of the parliaments. The COP30 meeting took place just in November 2025. The focus of that was intended to be forest protection, supporting climate vulnerable regions and marginalised communities, but everything that was talked about in the news afterwards more or less was about the carbon and the commitment to net zero and the lack of a commitment to fossil fuels within COP30. Do we think that COP30 has proven to be an effective mechanism, and is it getting less effective as time goes forward in addressing the needs around sustainable development?
Do you want me to have a go at that?
Yeah, go for it.
He looks to be looking in my direction. I mean, the COP process is, and today the US pulled out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and Biodiversity and about 30 or 40 other areas as well. The reality is that when the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, we were on a trajectory for about 4 degrees of warming, central projection. Latest best estimates are that we're currently on about 2.6 degrees, 2.8 degrees. There's been an improvement. It's flatlined over the last couple of years. Global economy has grown, population has grown. We haven't kind of really driven emission reductions down in a way in which we could do. So in that sense, I think you can say it certainly isn't successful in terms of driving climate action in a way which would be consistent with avoiding the very worst that we would expect to see. Or we've made some progress, but we haven't made enough progress. So the level of ambition isn't sufficient, and the translation of ambition into action is falling behind, and therefore we have a big kind of gap in terms of implementation and ambition. Having said that, it is at the moment the only thing that is driving this activity.
Yeah.
I think
So trying to find, trying to move it in a different direction or construct something else. The bottom line about this is that you need to have some way of getting countries to agree. And there are 195 countries signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement and have been taking action. Not enough action. But you won't find any other topic on anything where you've got 195 countries actually kind of sitting around and discussing and trying and moving and trying to move things on. So I think that that's probably the challenge is how do you do that? And how do you do that where we are now seeing for the geopolitical situation on a global scale, really changing rapidly in ways which are, very potentially kind of really damaging. Well, they are damaging, but not potentially. So that and sustainability is at the heart of that geopolitical transition and challenge as well.
Yeah, you're right to be optimistic about it. I think the original starting point, the trajectory was much, much worse than it has ended up as a result of the COP, the Coalition of Parliament meeting. So there is an element of optimism about it. Richard, is there any particular thoughts around, regulation and how that might drive and feed into sustainable development, and whether it's robust enough?
Okay, I think the regulation is a fascinating one, and this year I think we're waiting for a white paper. They've had the Cunliffe review. Pretty much that saying is that what we currently have in this country, from a water perspective, is a regulatory situation that doesn't work. We've allowed water companies to regulate themselves effectively for the last 35 years. The danger you've got is we'll create this superpower body that will probably incorporate the EA, Ofwat, and one or two others, that then seek to start drilling into water companies in a more powerful way, which may have some impact, but ultimately, I think what you've got to do is get you've got to reward companies, water companies, with good innovation, good performance. That's what we should be doing, rather than seeking to just hit them and penalise them. That's my view. I don't think if you just create a super body that's going to regulate by taking everybody to court is particularly a great idea. I think we should be rewarding innovation. So I come to the sort of operational side. Martin mentioned about carbon. EA's still got its target of 2030 to be net zero.
Yeah.
The reality is that because of construction being a significant part, we're sort of driving past 2080 with all our supply chain. We're just renewing it. They've all got to have it. So, yeah, they all will be scrambling around to make sure they've got it in place.
We can help.
Is that box ticking? Good business, yeah, great business. But that could, So, I don't, as an engineer, I possibly have a slightly different view to some of our panellists on what you can achieve. I mean, economics is a fascinating subject. I'm not an economist by training, but what I do know is in our world, we value property far too highly in terms of providing benefits, whereas nature, environment, social equity gets far less weighting.
Yep.
Yeah, the topic papers that you'll see around, I'm sure what you do at Cranfield, Martin, will say these subject areas are very important, but ultimately it doesn't drill down into reality at the moment. So I think we really need to be much more persuasive on this.
Yep.
And the reality is that a single property in Chelsea will be valued more highly for flood protection than a row of terraced houses in Clitheroe in Lancashire, where lots and lots of people live. And so that's where kind of you come back to this, how do you operationalize sustainability? And you say, okay, how is this actually going to affect people? And who's going to be affected and how are they affected? And our economic system doesn't support that decision-making in a kind of rational way of bringing those things to bear.
Excellent. Raoul, have we seen any significant changes in regulations in the EU recently?
Yes, so 2019 there was the publication of the European Green Deal with the big objectives of achieving carbon neutrality by 2015. Now last year there was then the omnibus package number 1, so discussing the reduction of parts of it. So there has been now a reduction, especially on the CSRD, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So the scope has been reduced. Also on the due diligence aspects, so sustainability due diligence, and the CSDDD, also a scope reduction. Simultaneously, they published the Clean Industry Deal, saying, okay, we still stick to the goals, and maybe it goes a little bit more into the part from what Richard was saying, more in emphasizing good work. So they proposed some labels. They want to come up with some labels on cement, for instance. So yeah, there for sure has been a reduction, but the overall goal is still there. But just in front of the COP, they discussed the goals for 2040, and I think there's also one interesting hint. They opened the aims of the towards carbon credit. So towards 5% you can reduce via carbon credits. So before it was always like reduction, and now you're also allowed to add some further carbon credits.
Okay, great. Jerry?
I am sorry if I keep interrupting. I think one of the issues you have, though, with the carbon credits these days is I think most people will acknowledge that the solution is actually in technology and innovation, as you were saying. And carbon credits, most of them, you need additionality, which means it's not a commercially viable product.
Yep.
But because of the nature of business nowadays, having something that would be saving the environment, supporting the environment is commercially viable, which means it wouldn't qualify for a carbon credit due to additionality. And we need to change that framework so green tech and innovation can qualify for carbon credits, which allows businesses, when they're offsetting their own footprints, to be investing in the future of green technology that will support the overall solution.
Interesting.
Sorry, that's my 10 pence.
So amazingly, we're beginning to run out of time. I was hoping to leave 10 to 15 minutes for questions, but I'd just like to address a kind of final point for the panel as a whole to discuss before we go to the wider room for questions around the rise of net zero skepticism. So, you know, I think, you know, global warming, climate change, you couldn't really design a better problem for humanity. It's invisible, it's intangible, if you're going to really believe in it, that it's happening, then you have to have some level of trust in science and possibly even a level of deference to scientists who produce the data that we work with. To me, it's perfectly clear, but for many others, there's a growth in net zero skepticism. Have any of you experienced that growth in your working lives, in your professional lives, or even in your personal lives? Jerry?
I'm happy to go again. So there is a lot of scepticism with net zero, and I think a lot of that feeling is the real meaning of it and what it is lost. So again, it's intangible, so people don't know how to apply it anymore, or it feels like it's a stick used to beat or a marketing thing. So instead of people going, you know, we want to be net zero, i.e. we're going to offset everything we've done and we're going to be almost that carbon neutral element, it's actually seeing the CO2e as a measurement, a currency, as just a way of going, it's a common sense approach to business, that triple bottom line, and letting people apply, because then once you start allowing people to look at it as just a risk-based operating factor, whether you believe in the science or not of whether the world is naturally warming or whether it's human impact, actually going, we have a problem, climate change is a risk, it's going to affect us all. How do we kind of mitigate that regardless of the science behind that? And then you would get people on board. One of the biggest risks you've had has been the net zero, the carbon footprinting, the continual requirement for people to do scope 1 and 2, scope 3, and then extended scope 3, is it becomes a marketing thing instead of a business common sense decision or a countrywide common sense decision. So actually making it more practicable and factual instead of that philanthropic, wonderful aspiration of net zero, moving it. There's no way we're going to meet the net zero thing by 2030. If you think how many businesses you're all looking at and auditing and seeing, and they're going for their net zero, i.e. we're going to buy a shed load of offsets for our last, how much is that going to hit the company's business? You'll suddenly find people will be disinterested in it when the bill hits. So using it as a measurable way of looking at a business, just like you look at the staff retention, just like you look at the finances of the business, still keeps that language around sustainability, but it might keep more people on board because they're seeing something practical, regardless of whether they believe in the science or not. A lot of the companies I see, they don't believe in the science. They're so done with that, they're moving on to the next thing. This just allows it to fall into that practical, applicable framework that they do with most of their management systems.
Yeah. Interesting. 2025 was the warmest year on record in the UK, globally as well, I think, actually. But even under those circumstances, there's still a growth in scepticism. Martin, have you experienced that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there is political the political consensus that there was on climate change has ruptured. So it was the Conservative government that brought in net zero as a legal requirement. So the Climate Change Act came in 2008 from the Labour government. It was Theresa May who, as her parting shot as she left government, changed the target to be net zero here in the UK. And there was political consensus across the board in the UK for net zero. And actually, we've been remarkably successful in decarbonising large parts of our economy. So we've gone 50% emissions reduction, and we've grown our economy compared to 1990. And if you look since 2007, we've consistently reduced the carbon intensity of our imports as well. So it's not just by offshoring all of our things. So, and we still have our lights on, and we're still driving, and we're still kind of heating homes, and we're still kind of doing a lot of our activities. So, but we are seeing that. We're also seeing people changing their job titles and carry on doing the same work. So we see that here in the UK as well as internationally. But I think we're also seeing companies recognizing that this is not going away. This is a problem that isn't going away. When I was at COP speaking to the Director General of the International Chamber of Commerce, they were very, very clear for business that business is on the net zero train. That train has left the station. Business is not getting off it. It might go slowly at some points or more quickly in others, depending on the kind of the political narrative and challenge of our time. But there's no hiding from the risks. Every single, and I speak to kind of company executives, and they see the effects of climate change, particularly if you speak to international companies. They see the effects of climate change every week in their business, having some sort of impact. All parts of the world. Doesn't matter what your political persuasion is, this is going to hit communities, people, businesses. So there's going to be no hiding from the consequences. And so, yes, there is some skepticism at the moment on net zero, but net zero is the only way of actually tackling the challenge that we have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And wishful thinking and all of these other things will not get us to where we need to be. It will just mean that there will be more economic cost and there will be more human cost until we get to where we need to be.
Yeah. Ariel or Raoul, you'll have a wider perspective, EU perspective, particularly in the general direction of movement around net zero skepticism in the EU, and perhaps, Ariel, you mentioned that, you've worked all over the world in various roles. Any thoughts on, out with the UK? Is it a similar picture in the EU and elsewhere in the globe?
I think in our case, I think people are more tired of the concept than any other thing. So people are really tired of these kind of like big concepts that they cannot see in real life. So when we discuss things so big as net zero, they don't really understand what that means for them, what that means for their business. And I think most of our clients are more focused on action, right? How can we act on this? What are the next steps for us to actually have a positive impact? So I do agree that focusing on carbon can be interesting, and we do a lot of carbon accounting. And I think it's a great way to identify hotspots and for people to understand where their emission sources are and what are the urgent conversations that they have to start having with their suppliers or their clients. But if we only focus on that, it's only a very, very small piece of the puzzle. Yeah. So that's why net zero emissions and carbon is such a small piece of the entire ESG strategy that they have to have. So it's a very small piece of the puzzle for them to start thinking about strategy and action. Mm-hmm. So yes, we try to kind of change the narrative a little bit in terms of net zero. So yes, that's one of the many goals that they should be thinking about and implementing in their company. But it's not only that. There's a lot of other environmental topics that they should be addressing. There's a lot of social topics that they should be addressing. So for example, in our case, we're more worried about pinkwashing rather than greenwashing. Yeah. It's a major thing, especially in the event sector, right? Like we're talking about a lot of people, and I think focusing on net zero or the numbers or carbon is stopping us from having the urgent conversations, basically talking to people, talking to the communities, talking to other companies, other businesses, other suppliers. Yeah, so just trying to change the narrative of that.
Absolutely. And finally, just so we leave enough time for questions, Raoul, in the EU, are you experiencing a similar kind of political environment?
Yes, so there's a lot of skepticism on net zero. Of course, you see it from the right-wing side. You were also asking for something personal. I realized more than a year ago we don't have a landing page on the Kiva part for climate adaptation. Okay. So I was like, oh, we need this urgently. There is an ISO framework and most probably also some certification schemes soon. So I think it also goes into the time of, okay, how do we adapt to the certain consequences? And it's also, I think, discussed this year more at the COP30.
Perfect. All right, good. Thank you very much, everybody. We've got kind of perhaps 8 minutes or so left. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? We might need a microphone handed round to be able to do this, but we can give it a try. Nigel. I think it's all right, Laura.
Hello. Okay, thank you. Now, obviously, I don't want to offend anybody because I'm all over environmental management in terms of ecology, protecting nature, flood defences, recycling your raw materials, reusing energy. But I want to build on what you said, Steve, about the scepticism about net zero in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere and the science behind that, and the whole sense that we are a business that relies on the success of our clients, which are manufacturing businesses.
Yep.
And I'm speaking, obviously, because climate change is now in all of the standards. To all the business leaders, and they are very, very, very sceptical about the whole removing carbon from the atmosphere because it's damaging their profitability. So if this is damaging the profitability of our clients, it's going to damage our profitability. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So when we see the whole kind of science behind that, and I look into that, the concept of removing the carbon, it kind of, you look at who's produced it, and the scientists, they've got conflicts of interest in their sort of financial backgrounds, and we all of the whole, the idea of removing carbon from the atmosphere, it's such a small proportion of the amount, it's less than 0.5% of the atmosphere of the air. Is it actually going to make any difference? I've seen reports that say carbon dioxide has nothing to do with warming, it's a result of warming rather than a precursor to it. So it kind of muddies the waters, doesn't it? And you've got things that people like President of the United States basically saying carbon removal is nonsense. That's a big deal, isn't it? So if we're following a strategy of net zero as a company, is that a risky strategy because it's politically exposed? Mm-hmm. So that kind of sort of sense that, we're quoting things like Agenda 2030 and the whole sort of back to the 1970s, the Club of Rome stuff. It sort of, it gives you a sense that, it makes me feel as if carbon removal is a system of rationing rather than actually going to do anything to the temperature of the earth. And I know, Raoul, you said about the companies that are doing well in these sustainability leagues have destroyed their manufacturing economies, such as Germany. So that's what's happening here as a result of the sort of strategies of government policy. So it feels like politics, and it feels like almost like a religious cult rather than anything that people can tangibly look at. So just building on what you said, Steve, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how you would react to that.
Happy to take that one on because
thank you.
Germany's economic kind of challenge is in part because they keep doing the same thing with fossil fuel-based automotives. And guess what? It's China who's taking their market. And China is taking a market on electric vehicles because it's looking at trying to solve a problem and actually kind of grow their economy at the same time.
China's not doing net zero as well.
Yes.
They do.
They're heading,
if
you look at China's commitments.
And China also has like their carbon goals, and we also see on product carbon footprint a lot of movements in China. So they developed so-called product category rules to calculate the carbon emission of the strategic products like solar modules, electrical car batteries, and cement. So they are also moving in implementing the carbon emission into their system.
China's actually...
China's power sector emissions are now falling.
Yeah, they're leading the world
because
in
they are
energy transformation.
the growth in power consumption in China, because its economy has grown, is more than met by renewables. India has got a declining coal base. 2025 had less coal burned in India than 2024 in its power sector. So it's an absolute myth that other countries are not doing things. Really great example from COP30 was South Korea committing to stopping burning coal by 2040. Okay, so consistent with 2050 emissions. Australia is absolutely petrified because nobody's going to buy its coal. The failure of the Michigan federal coal auction was because nobody wanted to buy the coal. They had 126 million tons of coal, and the most they got offered for all of that coal was $186,000 US. The auction collapsed. The next federal auction collapsed because people didn't want to buy that coal. President Trump doesn't shout about that.
It sort of feels like politics though, rather than we change the temperature. So the problem I've got is that our business is, the profitability of our business is dependent on the profitability of our manufacturing sector, which doesn't like this.
It won't be here if it doesn't kind of take action.
Richard.
I understand what you're saying. I've made a note, religious cult. But I equally understand what Martin's saying, so I'm sort of going to be in the middle a bit here. But to me, certainly in the work I get involved in, I come back to what I said, rewarding companies for innovation and actually making it easier. And now, what slightly worries me from a personal point of view of being carbon neutral is there's a lot of stuff come out recently that seems to be saying, oh God, we're not taxing people enough for this now, so we better start taxing them. Not sure that's a great idea. But that's a personal thing about how you live your life in a better way that can be carbon neutral, whatever you want to call it. But coming back to the businesses, certainly in EA work, I think that by trying to explain the science better, I come through this from an engineer, actually trying to demystify some of it. I think we've made progress on that, but I think we need to make it more understandable to people as to what it actually means and what it's telling us. And as I say, I think we need to, rather than hit people with big fines and all that, you need a penalty, but equally we should be rewarding companies for following this route rather than, and as I say, innovation particularly. So that would be my stance.
Okay, great. Thank you, Richard. So we're actually out of time. We've got a 15-minute break now. If anybody has any other questions related to any of the discussion that we've had, I guess we'll be around for the next little while if you want to come up and ask us directly. But listen, thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time to listen to us. Many, many grateful thanks to our panel as well for the very valuable input. That's been really useful. Thank you very much.